There is a peculiar kind of ache that comes from loving something you no longer know how to reach. It is not the sharp pain of betrayal, nor the clean grief of final loss, but a dull, lingering tension between hope and resignation. You tell yourself that it is finished because the evidence seems to insist upon it. Words have been spoken that cannot be unsaid. Doors appear closed. Time has passed. Reason nods solemnly and says this is over. And yet something stubborn remains within you, something that refuses to call the matter settled. It is this inner resistance to despair that often embarrasses us most, because it feels unreasonable. But reason, when honest, must admit that not everything true is immediately provable. We are inclined to believe that love, once broken, obeys the same rules as glass. Shattered things, we say, may be swept away or perhaps reshaped into something else, but they cannot be made whole again. This belief comforts us because it gives suffering a clean edge. If restoration is impossible, then surrender feels noble. Yet the difficulty with this assumption is that love was never a material thing to begin with. It does not crack in straight lines, nor does it obey the physics we assign to it in our attempts to feel wise. When God speaks of restoration, He is not speaking in the language of human optimism. He does not mean pretending nothing happened, or forcing two wounded hearts back into proximity as if time itself were a bandage. Restoration, in the divine sense, is not a return to the past, but the creation of something that could not have existed before the breaking. This is why it so often appears impossible to us. We imagine God working only with the pieces we recognize, while He is concerned with parts of the soul we have never examined. What makes love feel irreparable is not merely what was done, but what was believed afterward. We tell ourselves stories in the aftermath of pain, that we were foolish to hope, that the love was an illusion, that God was silent when we needed Him most. These conclusions feel earned, because they are paid for in tears. But pain, for all its authority, is a poor judge of ultimate truth. It can describe the wound precisely while being entirely wrong about the future of the body. If God is saying, "I will restore this love," it is not because circumstances look favorable, it is precisely because they do not. Divine restoration does not wait for permission from probability. It enters where all human calculations have already failed. This is why faith is rarely dramatic at first. It begins as a quiet disagreement with despair. Not a denial of facts, but a refusal to let facts have the final word. We must also confront an uncomfortable possibility, that what feels impossible to us feels that way because we are imagining restoration without transformation. We want the love back, but not the change. We want the comfort, but not the reshaping of the self that comfort demands. God, however, does not mend love the way a tailor mends fabric. He works more like a surgeon, removing what would poison the body if left untouched. The delay we interpret as abandonment is often preparation. It is tempting to think that if God truly intended to restore a love, He would do so quickly, decisively, and without confusion. But haste is a human virtue, not a divine one. God is never late, yet He is almost never rushed. The slowness of restoration is not evidence against it. It is the method by which shallow versions of love are quietly dismantled so that something truer can take their place. When love seems impossible to restore, it is usually because we are measuring it by our own capacity to forgive, to trust, to begin again. But God does not ask us to supply the power for what He promises to complete. He asks only that we remain open enough not to declare the story finished while He is still writing in places we cannot yet see. What we often call the impossibility of restoration is usually nothing more than our exhaustion wearing the costume of wisdom. After waiting, hoping, praying, and watching nothing visibly change, the soul grows tired and declares a verdict. It says, "Enough. This is not how things work. If love were meant to return, it would have done so by now." This sounds reasonable, even mature, yet it rests on a fragile assumption that time is the same thing as finality. Time can distance events, dull emotions, and rearrange memory, but it does not possess the authority to cancel what God has spoken into being. When God says He will restore a love, He is not responding to our impatience, He is addressing a deeper disorder. Love does not collapse merely because two people drift apart or circumstances intervene. It collapses because fear replaces trust, because pride hardens where humility once lived, because wounds are nursed until they become identities. Restoration, then, must reach beneath the visible separation and confront the invisible corrosion. This work is slow not because God lacks power, but because He refuses to perform cosmetic miracles that leave the disease untouched. We misunderstand restoration because we imagine it as reversal. We picture God rewinding events, undoing mistakes, erasing conversations, and returning two people to a safer version of themselves. But reversal would only guarantee repetition. A restored love that has not passed through truth would simply break again at the same pressure points. God is less interested in saving us from pain than in saving us from falsehood, even when the falsehood feels comforting. The greatest obstacle to restored love is not distance, silence, or even betrayal. It is the quiet conviction that we now know better than hope. Once pain has educated us, we begin to trust our conclusions more than God's promises. We learn how quickly affection can evaporate, how fragile vows can be, how easily intentions bend under strain. These lessons feel undeniable, and yet they are incomplete. They teach us about human weakness while telling us nothing about divine persistence. When God speaks restoration, He is not ignoring what happened. He is accounting for it more fully than we can. He sees not only the damage, but also the precise way the damage can be redeemed. What looks to us like a permanent fracture may, in His hands, become the very line along which something stronger is formed. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is the consistent pattern of how God works with broken things. He does not discard what has failed. He transforms it so thoroughly that its failure becomes part of its meaning. There is also the uncomfortable truth that restored love often requires the death of the version of love we were attached to. We may grieve not only the person, but the role they played in stabilizing our sense of self. God's promise to restore love does not include preserving our illusions. He will dismantle dependency disguised as devotion, fear mistaken for passion, and control masquerading as care. What remains after this stripping can feel frighteningly empty, but emptiness is not absence, it is readiness. Impossibility, from a human perspective, usually means beyond my control. This is precisely where God begins His most deliberate work. As long as we believe restoration depends on our effort, our words, or our endurance, we will oscillate between anxiety and despair. But when we finally accept that we cannot engineer the outcome, we create space for God to act without interference. Surrender is not giving up on love, it is giving up the demand to dictate how love must return. If God is restoring this love, He is doing so in ways that may feel indirect, even unrelated. He may be reshaping character, softening resistance, exposing motives, or healing wounds that predate the relationship itself. We judge progress by proximity and communication, while God measures it by truth and readiness. What seems like delay may actually be alignment, and what feels like silence may be restraint, preventing a premature reunion that would only reopen the same old wounds. One of the most difficult truths to accept about restored love is that God rarely works on both hearts in the same visible way or at the same apparent speed. We assume that if restoration is truly intended, clarity should arrive simultaneously, conviction should mirror itself, and movement should be obvious. When this does not happen, we interpret the imbalance as proof that nothing is happening at all, yet this expectation reveals more about our need for reassurance than about God's method. He is not synchronizing appearances, He is cultivating depth. We are tempted to believe that love can only be restored once understanding is mutual and intentions are spoken aloud. But God often begins restoration in silence because silence exposes what noise can conceal. In the absence of reassurance, high, deadened motives rise to the surface. We discover whether we desire reunion for comfort or for truth, for familiarity or for genuine reconciliation. This self-knowledge is rarely pleasant, but without it, restored love would rest on unstable ground. God's work in restoring love frequently feels like subtraction rather than addition. Expectations are stripped away, certainties dissolve. The future we rehearsed so carefully becomes inaccessible. We call this loss, but God calls it clarification. Love that survives only under ideal conditions is not yet love strong enough to be entrusted with permanence. By removing what cannot endure, God prepares the heart for something that can. Another reason restoration appears impossible is that we mistake emotional intensity for spiritual significance. Strong feelings convince us that something must be done immediately. When action does not follow emotion, we assume God is absent or unwilling. But emotion, while powerful, is not a reliable guide. It surges and recedes, exaggerates and distorts. God does not despise emotion, but he refuses to be governed by it. He is forming something stable enough to outlast moods, seasons, and circumstances. There is also the hidden labor of memory. When love breaks, memory becomes selective. We either idealize what was or rehearse what wounded us, depending on which narrative helps us survive the present moment. God's restoration requires a more honest remembering, one that neither romanticizes nor condemns. This balanced memory allows forgiveness to grow without denial and accountability without bitterness. Such memory cannot be forced. It matures slowly, like a muscle that must be used gently before it can bear weight. Often what we call waiting is actually resistance. We wait for God to act while quietly insisting that he act according to our understanding. We tell ourselves we are being patient, yet we remain inwardly rigid. True waiting is not passive, but it is flexible. It allows God to redefine what restoration will look like. Many restored loves do not resemble their former shape. They are humbler, quieter, less dramatic, but far more real. We struggle to accept this because we mourn the intensity we once mistook for depth. God's promise to restore love does not guarantee the restoration of roles, timing, or expectations. It guarantees the restoration of what is true. This distinction matters. We may desire the return of certainty, labels, and visible commitment, while God is focused on restoring trust, integrity, and freedom. What feels incomplete to us may already be whole in his terms, simply not yet expressed in ways we recognize. Impossibility also arises when we attempt to predict outcomes based on current behavior. We observe distance and assume permanence, silence and assume disinterest, resistance and assume finality. Yet human behavior under fear is a poor indicator of ultimate intention. God sees beyond defensive patterns and temporary withdrawals. He is not fooled by appearances, nor is he discouraged by setbacks. He works beneath the surface, where transformation is slowest but most enduring. If love is being restored, it will not return as an interruption of God's work, but as its result. It will emerge naturally from hearts that have been reoriented toward truth rather than need. This is why forcing outcomes only delays them. God is not withholding love. He is protecting it from being rebuilt on the same fragile foundation that caused it to collapse in the first place. There is a subtle danger in believing that restored love must feel familiar in order to be genuine. Familiarity comforts us because it allows us to navigate without vigilance. We know the patterns, the rhythms, the emotional shortcuts, yet it is often this very familiarity that once concealed the seeds of collapse. God's intention in restoring love is not to return us to ease, but to lead us into truth. And truth, when first encountered, rarely feels comfortable. It feels exposed, slower, and far less flattering to our illusions about ourselves. We often underestimate how much of what we called love was sustained by fear. Fear of being alone, fear of being unseen, fear of losing the version of ourselves that existed only in another's gaze. When love breaks, these fears surface with startling clarity. We long for restoration not merely because we miss the person, but because we miss the protection their presence seemed to offer against our own emptiness. God, however, is not interested in restoring love that functions as shelter from the self. He intends love to be an offering, not a hiding place. This is why restored love so frequently requires solitude before reunion. Solitude dismantles the illusion that another person can complete what only God can sustain. It reveals how much of our longing was actually hunger misdirected. In this space, God teaches the soul to stand without leaning, to desire without clinging, to hope without demanding immediate fulfillment. Such formation feels like loss because it removes what once soothed us, but it is, in fact, preparation. Another difficulty lies in our tendency to moralize the outcome. We assume that if love is restored, it proves our faith was correct, our patience rewarded, our interpretation vindicated. And if it is not, we conclude that we failed to believe properly or that God changed his mind. Both conclusions miss the point. Restoration is not a verdict on our performance, it is an expression of God's wisdom. Sometimes he restores the relationship itself. Sometimes he restores the capacity to love rightly, even if the form that love takes is different than we expected. We must also confront the reality that restored love demands greater responsibility than the original love ever did. The first time, ignorance allowed us to be careless. The second time, knowledge removes that excuse. To love again after breaking requires attentiveness, restraint, honesty, and courage. God does not restore love lightly because restored love carries weight. It demands maturity where once there was instinct, and intention where once there was impulse. What feels impossible is often the prospect of loving without guarantees. Before the breaking, we assumed continuity. After it, we know too much. We know how easily words can fracture trust, how silence can wound, how good intentions can still cause harm. God does not erase this knowledge. He redeems it. He teaches the heart to love with open eyes rather than blind optimism. This kind of love is quieter, less intoxicating, but far more enduring. There is a deep humility required to receive restored love. It requires admitting that neither party fully understood what they were doing the first time. Pride resists this admission. It prefers narratives of blame or innocence. God dissolves these narratives because they prevent reconciliation. Restoration cannot occur where one heart stands above the other. It requires both to kneel before truth, even when that truth complicates the story they tell about themselves. Impossibility, in spiritual terms, often means that God is removing our last illusions of control. As long as we believe we can manage love, we will attempt to engineer its return. When we finally accept that we cannot, we become receptive rather than strategic. This receptivity is not weakness, it is alignment. It places the soul in a posture where God's work can be received rather than resisted. If God is restoring this love, it will arrive not as a dramatic reversal, but as a quiet recognition. You will notice less urgency and more clarity, less anxiety and more steadiness. What once felt desperate will feel deliberate. What once demanded proof will rest in trust. And you may realize that what truly seemed impossible was not the restoration itself, but becoming the kind of person capable of receiving it without destroying it again. There is a profound difference between wanting love restored and being ready for it to return. Desire can survive on imagination alone, but readiness requires alignment with truth. This is where many hearts falter. We pray for restoration while quietly hoping it will cost us nothing beyond what we have already suffered. Yet restored love, if it is to endure, must pass through accountability. God does not return love to the same hands without first reshaping how those hands will hold it. One of the hardest lessons in this process is learning that sincerity is not the same as soundness. We may be deeply sincere in our regret, our longing, our promises to do better, but sincerity without wisdom is fragile. God is not persuaded by intensity of emotion alone. He is attentive to whether the inner structure of the heart has changed. Has pride softened into humility? Has defensiveness given way to listening? Has love learned to value truth more than comfort? These changes cannot be rushed, and they cannot be faked. We often imagine that if love were restored, joy would immediately follow. But joy is not always the first emotion to arrive. Often, restored love begins with sobriety. There is a quiet seriousness that accompanies second chances, a recognition that something sacred is being entrusted again. God does not cheapen what he restores by wrapping it in constant exhilaration. He steadies it, he grounds it, he removes the excess that once made it intoxicating but unstable. Another illusion that must be surrendered is the belief that restored love will resolve our inner conflicts. We hope that reunion will silence our doubts, heal our insecurities, and give our lives coherence again. But no relationship, however restored, can bear that weight. God will not place the burden of your wholeness on another human being. If he is restoring love, he is doing so between two souls who are learning to stand before him independently, not leaning on each other for salvation. This is why God often delays restoration until disappointment has done its honest work. Disappointment strips fantasy from faith. It exposes what we were expecting love to be rather than what it actually is. While disappointment feels like loss, it is also clarity. It forces us to ask whether we desire the person themselves or the version of life we imagined with them. Restored love cannot be built on imagined futures. It must grow from present truth. Forgiveness also takes on a deeper meaning in this process. Forgiveness is not amnesia, nor is it permission to repeat harm. It is the willingness to release the right to define the future solely by the past. God's forgiveness operates this way, and he invites us into the same discipline. Without this form of forgiveness, restored love would be nothing more than a fragile truce, constantly threatened by memory. True forgiveness creates space where trust can be rebuilt slowly, without denial or haste. There is a quiet courage required to accept that restored love may expose new vulnerabilities. Once broken, the heart is aware of its own fragility. Loving again means consenting to risk with knowledge rather than ignorance. God does not remove this risk, he sanctifies it. He teaches the heart to choose love not because it is safe, but because it is right. This choice carries a depth that first love rarely possesses. Impossibility, as we define it, often means that we can no longer rely on momentum. Before the breaking, love carried itself forward. Afterward, every step must be chosen. God values this chosen love because it is no longer accidental. It is deliberate, informed, and restrained by wisdom. Such love is less dramatic, but it is far more faithful. If God is restoring this love, it will not arrive as a reward for endurance, but as a consequence of transformation. You will recognize it not by the absence of fear, but by the presence of peace, not by overwhelming emotion, but by quiet confidence. And you may find that what once felt impossible was not the restoration of love, but the surrender required to let God restore it in his way, rather than yours. At the deepest level, the restoration of love confronts our understanding of trust. Trust, once broken, does not return by command or by repetition of promises. It returns through evidence, quietly accumulated over time. God understands this better than we do. That is why he does not hurry trust back into existence, even when longing is sincere. Trust that reappears too quickly is often built on fear of loss rather than confidence in truth. God refuses to rebuild love on fear, because fear will always demand proof where faith asks only for consistency. We often ask God to restore love while still rehearsing arguments in our minds. We prepare explanations, defenses, and speeches for a future moment that may never arrive. This mental preparation feels productive, but it keeps us anchored in control. God's restoration requires a different posture, one of listening rather than persuading. Love that must be argued back into existence has not yet reached the ground where reconciliation can take root. God waits until words are no longer weapons or tools, but expressions of reality. Another barrier to restored love is the assumption that clarity must precede commitment. We want every question answered before we take even the smallest step forward. Yet clarity often follows obedience rather than preceding it. God frequently asks the heart to act in alignment with truth before that truth feels emotionally settled. This does not mean ignoring wisdom. It means trusting that wisdom grows through practice, not speculation. Love matures by being lived rightly, not merely analyzed. There is also the quiet work of humility that restoration demands. Humility is not humiliation, nor is it self-erasure. It is the willingness to see oneself accurately, without embellishment or defense. In restored love, humility allows both hearts to acknowledge that they were not merely wounded by circumstances, but shaped by habits that contributed to the fracture. This acknowledgement does not assign equal blame, but it creates equal responsibility for the future. Without humility, love returns only to repeat its collapse. God's promise to restore love also challenges our understanding of justice. We often believe that restoration should follow confession, remorse, and visible change in a clear sequence. When this sequence does not unfold as expected, we interpret it as unfairness or indifference. But God's justice is restorative, not transactional. He is not balancing accounts, he is healing what has been disordered. This healing may involve consequences that feel uneven, but its purpose is alignment, not punishment. It is important to recognize that restored love is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself with certainty or spectacle. It grows quietly, often beneath doubt, strengthened by ordinary faithfulness rather than extraordinary emotion. We miss this growth because we are watching for signs that match our imagination. God, however, prefers signs that endure rather than impress. A calm conversation where there was once hostility, a moment of restraint where there was once reaction, a willingness to listen where there was once accusation. These are the markers of real restoration. Impossibility fades not when circumstances suddenly change, but when the heart becomes willing to live without guarantees. Love restored by God is not secured by promises of permanence, but by commitment to truth in the present moment. This kind of love does not demand assurance of tomorrow, it practices faithfulness today. Such faithfulness, repeated consistently, becomes its own assurance. There is also a freedom that accompanies restored love when it is truly God's work. It does not cling. It does not threaten collapse if misunderstood or delayed. It can breathe. This freedom is not detachment but confidence. It knows that love sustained by God does not depend on constant vigilance or control. It trusts that what God restores, He also sustains. In the end, the greatest transformation may not be the return of love itself, but the reordering of the heart that no longer needs to grasp at it. When love is restored in this way, it is no longer treated as a possession to secure, but as a gift to steward. And it is often only at this point, when love is no longer demanded, feared, or idolized, that it becomes possible for it to remain.